Imagine a time when holiday meals felt both familiar and daring, when kitchens hummed with quiet experiments and families gathered around tables set with heirloom bowls. In this video, we're journeying back to the 1970s, a decade that tucked countless Christmas soups into its culinary corners, only to let them fade away. Today, we rediscover those forgotten flavors, dust off those old recipes, and remember the subtle warmth they once brought to festive winter nights. Number 1. Creamed chestnut and parsnip blend. In the 1970s, certain American households presented a creamed chestnut and parsnip soup at Christmas dinners, quietly merging old-world agrarian roots with a decade in flux. Baby boomers raised on post-war abundance found themselves intrigued by the subtlety of chestnuts simmered in light broths and pureed with sweet parsnips sourced from local farms. Cookbook pamphlets distributed in suburban markets suggested roasting chestnuts over open flames or gas burners, then blending them until velvety smooth. No single celebrity chef championed this dish, yet it surfaced in countless community church cookbooks and December newspaper clippings. Served in floral-patterned ceramic bowls, perhaps inherited from earlier generations, the soup's gentle nuttiness and earthy sweetness evoked romanticized old America. By the early 1980s, convenience foods and international influences nudged it aside, making this once refined starter a rarely mentioned memory stored in yellowed recipe cards. Number 2. Oyster and celery root broth. In coastal enclaves and a few inland cities striving for culinary sophistication, oyster and celery root broth offered a delicate marine note to Christmas Eve gatherings. During the 1970s, fresh oysters still appeared in local markets each December, and celery root, once considered old-fashioned, gained renewed respect through articles praising locally sourced winter vegetables. Home cooks simmered shucked oysters in creamy broths enriched by pureed celery root, sometimes adding a whisper of white pepper. Hosting relatives who cherish maritime traditions from the 1930s and 1940s, families used this soup to reconnect with distant culinary pasts. Served before a main roast or holiday ham, it balanced decadent flavors with seasonal restraint. By the following decade, when mass-produced chowders and seafood spreads dominated, this subtle, briny broth simply drifted from collective memory. Number 3. Almond-scented turkey giblet consommé. Rooted in thriftiness and resourcefulness, turkey giblet consommé infused with a faint almond aroma once signaled skillful home economy at 1970s Christmas tables. Boiling turkey necks, gizzards, and hearts for hours alongside subtle herb bouquets, cooks strained the liquid meticulously to achieve crystalline clarity. Adding a hint of almond extract, recommended by certain mid-century homemaking magazines, lent unexpected depth to what might otherwise seem ordinary. This soup emerged quietly, often served in delicate teacups before the main feast, reflecting the era's search for refined simplicity. The presence of leftover turkey parts ensured nothing went to waste, a reminder of times when families still remembered leaner decades. Once the 1980s introduced flashier global appetizers, the understated, almond-kissed turkey giblet broth vanished, leaving behind only faint recollections in family scrapbooks. Number 4. Spiced apple and butternut velouté. During the mid to late 1970s, magazine columns encouraged experimenting with mild fruit-vegetable blends at Christmas. A spiced apple and butternut squash velouté exemplified this seasonal creativity, blending orchard bounty with comforting winter squash. Lightly sweetened by stewed apples and thickened with carefully simmered squash, this soup whispered warm holiday notes through hints of cinnamon and nutmeg. Baby boomers, eager to impress guests before unwrapping presents or heading to midnight mass, enjoyed this gentle twist on tradition. Vintage December editions of lifestyle magazines showcased elegant table settings featuring these smooth golden bowls, often garnished with toasted pumpkin seeds. Yet as American palates shifted toward either bolder ethnic spices or simpler convenience dishes, the apple butternut velouté receded quietly, eclipsed by more predictable flavors and packaged holiday mixes. Number 5. Leek and chestnut bisque with sherry. In certain prosperous suburbs, where old Hollywood glamour influenced holiday aesthetics, leek and chestnut bisque infused with a splash of dry sherry provided a sophisticated opener. Drawing on recipes from early 20th century European gastronomic literature, home economists in the 1970s adapted these guidelines for American kitchens. Leeks caramelized slowly in butter, chestnuts painstakingly peeled and simmered until tender, then blended into a creamy consistency. Sherry imparted a subtle depth, transforming a humble bowl into something worthy of admiration. Such bisques made brief appearances in holiday dinner parties, where polished silverware and vinyl records of Bing Crosby's carols set the scene. By the time Gen X hosts preferred lighter appetizers and world cuisines, this elegantly understated bisque faded, leaving behind a nostalgic echo in the memories of a few discerning diners. Number 6. Corn and salt cod chowder. In regions influenced by old New England traditions, corn and salt cod chowder once surfaced around Christmas as a nod to centuries-old maritime customs. Though salt cod felt archaic to some 1970s cooks, it appealed to families tracing roots back to earlier eras when preserving fish was essential. Combined with sweet kernel corn, onions, and cream, this chowder balanced the brine of salted fish with gentle sweetness. Cookbooks printed by coastal historical societies encouraged reviving such dishes, connecting modern baby boomers with the robust flavors their grandparents savored. While popular for a few seasons, the rising availability of fresh seafood and a preference for lighter fare eventually sidelined salt cod. By the 1980s, more contemporary seafood bisques replaced these old-fashioned chowders, and this Christmas nod to maritime heritage faded from general practice. Number 7. Mushroom and barley potage with vermouth. Influenced by late 1970s interest in European farmhouse cooking, mushroom and barley potage served during Christmas gatherings promised rustic comfort and subtle elegance. Families discovering sophisticated ingredients often turned to dry vermouth for aromatic complexity, pouring it sparingly into simmering pots of forest mushrooms and plump barley grains. Articles in regional newspapers recommended pairing it with crusty bread and soft candlelight, suggesting a continental flair. The soup's hearty texture and nutty undertones pleased relatives who remembered the hearty stews of the 1940s, while its delicate vermouth aroma impressed younger guests. Yet as culinary trends pivoted toward Mediterranean flavors and fresh herbs in the 1980s, this old world-inspired potage lost its foothold. Its memory now lingers only in a handful of yellowed recipe cards and dim recollections. Number 8. Creamed celery and hazelnut infusion. Creamed celery soup, once considered a humble staple, found brief holiday stardom in the 1970s when creative cooks introduced hazelnut nuances. Additions like ground hazelnuts and a hint of cream transformed a basic vegetable soup into a refined Christmas starter. Influenced by European nut-based sauces and hints gleaned from travel magazines, this infusion represented the era's tentative global explorations. It appeared on tables adorned with tinsel and hand-me-down ornaments, surprising guests with its mild sweetness and buttery texture. However, hazelnuts then were not as ubiquitous as they would become later, and the effort of toasting and grinding them discouraged repeat performances. Once convenience and international variety took center stage, this subtle, creamed celery hazelnut invention drifted back into obscurity. Number 9. Cauliflower and chestnut puree with white pepper. During a time when French-inspired cooking influenced American holiday menus, cauliflower and chestnut puree seasoned with a pinch of white pepper occasionally surfaced at Christmas feasts. Guides from the 1970s, borrowing from French culinary traditions, encouraged blending mild cauliflower florets with chestnuts to create a rich, ivory-tinted soup. White pepper's gentle heat replaced more common black pepper, a subtle sign of culinary sophistication. Served in porcelain bowls, it complemented candlelit ambiances and the nostalgic melodies on radio stations replaying old tunes from the 1950s. Yet as late 20th century palates demanded either robust ethnic flavors or straightforward classics, this delicate balance no longer felt essential. Over time, the once stylish cauliflower-chestnut combination disappeared, leaving behind only a faint whisper in dusty cookbook pages. Number 10. Chicken and chestnut brodo with sage, drawing on older Italian-American holiday customs that re-emerged during the 1970s. Chicken and chestnut brodo, infused with sage, provided a soothing, warm welcome to family gatherings. Although chicken broth was common, the addition of chestnuts and fragrant sage leaves signaled Christmas exclusivity. Many learned this recipe through relatives who had immigrated decades earlier, preserving old-world winter dishes. Prepared slowly, often the day before the holiday meal, the brodo let flavors deepen overnight. On Christmas Day, ladled into simple earthenware bowls, it harmonized with the gentle hum of family chatter. By the 1980s and beyond, as supermarkets stocked endless ready-made broths and global soups gained popularity, the chestnut sage variation retreated into culinary memory, rarely revisited except in nostalgic reflections of vanished traditions. Number 11. Turnip and chestnut velvet with tarragon. Responding to the era's encouragement to revisit root vegetables, a turnip and chestnut velvet soup dusted lightly with tarragon briefly captured the imagination of holiday hosts. Turnips, often underappreciated, brought earthy depth, while chestnuts softened their sharpness. Light cream and careful pureeing yielded a velvety consistency, and a hint of tarragon lent a faint licorice aroma. Gourmet publications of the 1970s praised such subtle contrasts, framing them as continental refinements that set progressive households apart. Served at candlelit dinners following caroling or gift exchanges, it offered a gentle start before heavier roasts. As soon as convenience-driven cooking and more assertive flavors came into vogue, this gentle root and nut combination lost its appeal, fading from collective holiday repertoires by the decade's end. Number 12. Beet and apple consommé with caraway. During the 1970s, culinary experimentation led some to craft a beet and apple consommé enlivened by caraway seeds, aiming to fuse old rural traditions with a modern holiday twist. Beets, once considered rustic fare, turned sophisticated when clarified into a jewel-toned broth, while apples imparted a mild, natural sweetness. Caraway seeds hinted at Central European influences, and magazines suggested this as a first course to prompt conversation. The soup's distinctive hue contrasted beautifully with white table linens and silver ladles, evoking images of vintage European winter markets. Yet its unfamiliar flavor combinations challenged conservative palates. Once the 1980s arrived with simpler, more recognizable dishes and global fusion that overshadowed subtle old country nuances, the beet apple caraway consommé quietly vanished from most Christmas menus. Number 13. Parsnip and almond potage with lemon zest. As Americans in the 1970s rediscovered parsnips and experimented with nut-based thickeners, a parsnip and almond potage brightened by a subtle lemon zest note emerged as a curious Christmas offering. Food writers encouraged pairing earthy roots with creamy almonds, suggesting this potage as a precursor to the holiday feast. Lemon zest elevated the flavors, ensuring that the soup didn't taste too heavy. It appealed to those who read gourmet columns while listening to vinyl records of vintage carols and sipped glasses of domestic white wine. Despite positive reactions, the complexity of prepping almonds and balancing flavors deterred busy hosts from making it annually. Once cheaper, easier options arrived, the parsnip almond potage receded into culinary folklore, referenced only in occasional nostalgic anecdotes. Number 14. Ham bone broth with dried peaches and cloves. Influenced by colonial-era culinary revivals popular in the 1970s, ham bone broth simmered with dried peaches and cloves evoked a time-honored sense of American heritage. Home economists suggested resurrecting this idea for Christmas, recalling early settlers who combined preserved fruits and savory meats to endure winter's scarcity. The resulting broth delivered a faintly sweet, mildly spiced aroma that intrigued guests tired of predictable holiday starters. Families who embraced history-themed festivities or decorated their homes with antique ornaments found this soup fitting. Still, dried peaches weren't universally available, and balancing sweet, salty, and spicy elements proved challenging. As lifestyles modernized and supermarket shelves expanded, simpler soups stole the spotlight, relegating this fruit-laced ham bone broth to a footnote in culinary history. Number 15. Split pea and chestnut cream with bay leaf. In the search for new seasonal twists, 1970s households experimented by enhancing humble split pea soup with chestnuts and a faint bay leaf scent. The chestnuts lent a softer, creamier texture, while bay leaves contributed a gentle herbal note. Cookbook clubs and neighborhood recipe exchanges circulated these instructions, sometimes calling it a festive pea cream to differentiate it from everyday fare. Served in stoneware bowls on December evenings, it acknowledged the nostalgia for frugal, comforting soups that had nourished earlier generations. However, as processed pea soups and emerging global flavors offered quicker or more exciting alternatives, the delicate pea chestnut variation receded. By the time more robust culinary trends arrived, this subtle seasonal adaptation had disappeared from Yuletide tables. Number 16. Smoked trout and rosemary consommé. In a decade that valorized both nature's bounty and European refinement, smoked trout and rosemary consommé earned brief attention at Christmas gatherings. Its preparation demanded patience, simmering fish bones, clarifying the broth, and infusing it with fragrant rosemary sprigs. The smoky trout aroma suggested pastoral scenes and evergreen forests, aligning with 1970s romanticization of simpler times. Served in small porcelain cups, it prepared the palate for the forthcoming feast. Yet smoked trout was not as readily accessible in all regions, and the fragile balance of flavors could easily tip too earthy or too fishy. The complexity discouraged repeated attempts. As culinary markets globalized and fresher, lighter seafood recipes became available, this delicate consommé vanished, leaving only ghostly mentions in obscure dinner party recollections. Number 17. Jerusalem artichoke and hazelnut cream. The 1970s emphasis on rediscovering overlooked produce led some adventurous cooks to feature Jerusalem artichokes in their Christmas soups. Blending them with hazelnuts and cream created a gentle nuttiness, while the artichoke's subtle, earthy sweetness recalled an earlier era of homegrown root crops. Gourmet newsletters encouraged serving it in minimalist bowls, framed by candlelight and vintage decorations. Still, Jerusalem artichokes could be tricky to handle, sometimes causing digestive discomfort if not cooked properly. Hazelnuts, then less common in everyday kitchens, added expense and effort. Such drawbacks limited its popularity. As demand for simpler, more universally appealing dishes grew, Jerusalem artichoke cream faded, remembered only by those who once dabbled in culinary curiosity during quieter Christmases past. Number 18. Pheasant and wild rice broth with thyme. At a time when game meats occasionally featured in holiday menus for added distinction, pheasant and wild rice broth, seasoned with thyme, briefly captured the imaginations of certain 1970s hosts. Drawing on romanticized images of rural America and old-world hunting traditions, the soup symbolized rustic elegance. Simmered pheasant bones and meat produced a delicate, savory base, while wild rice introduced a chewy texture and subtle nuttiness. Thyme rounded out the flavors, making each spoonful soothing yet refined. Although recipes for such soups circulated in regional food magazines, cost and availability limited their reach. When the 1980s brought more standardized, accessible Christmas fare, pheasant-based broths receded into the culinary shadows, no longer aligning with mainstream holiday tastes. Number 19, Celeriac and Apple bisque with marjoram. As culinary writers experimented with winter produce, celeriac, celery root, and apple bisque, enlivened with a hint of marjoram, emerged as a quietly inventive 1970s Christmas soup. The knobby celeriac, rarely showcased, paired unexpectedly well with the natural tartness of apples. Pureed and enriched with a touch of cream, the soup acquired a balanced profile, earthy yet gently sweet, comforting yet unusual. Marjoram provided a floral herbal note reminiscent of old Europe. Cookbooks promoting seasonal authenticity suggested it for intimate holiday dinners. However, celeriac never gained mass popularity, and guests often preferred more familiar starters. As broader culinary influences flooded American kitchens, celeriac apple bisque became an oddity of a transitional era, its name invoked only when rediscovering forgotten roots. Number 20. Pumpkin and chestnut veloute with white wine. By the late 1970s, Americans had begun experimenting more confidently with blending squash and nuts into refined, seasonal soups. Pumpkin and chestnut veloute, finished with a splash of dry white wine, offered a final example of these vanished Christmas dishes. The pumpkin, often associated with autumn, extended its role into the December feast, while chestnuts contributed richness. White wine, frequently recommended by gourmet editors, gave the velouté a delicate acidity. Presented in gleaming tureens on tables decorated with vintage ornaments, this soup hinted at both culinary ambition and nostalgic comfort. Yet as the 1980s arrived and holiday cuisine branched into global fusion or simplified classics, the nuanced pumpkin-chestnut combination no longer fit prevailing trends. Gradually, it slipped from memory, leaving behind only a faint seasonal echo in old-fashioned recipe files.